Okay, this section is the basic definitions and hierarchy of the quadrilaterals. So the way a hierarchy works is if you have an isosceles trapezoid right here, all isosceles trapezoids are trapezoids. Every trapezoid is a quadrilateral. Every kite is a quadrilateral. Every square is a rectangle. Every square is a rhombus. Every rhombus is a parallelogram. Every rectangle is a parallelogram. Every parallelogram is a quadrilateral. But it doesn't go backwards. You can't do every parallelogram is a rectangle. It needs to go from the bottom up. Some parallelograms are rectangles. Some parallelograms are rhombuses. These are special types of parallelograms. These are special types of trapezoids, and kites are kind of off on their own. So a quadrilateral is a four-sided polygon. A parallelogram, the definition has two sets of opposite sides parallel. A square has 4 90 degrees or 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. A rhombus has 4 congruent sides. A rectangle has 4 90-degree angles. So you can kind of see how a rectangle has 4 90s, a rhombus has 4 equal sides, and they come together to make a square. And then down here, a kite has 2 sets of consecutive, so in a row, sides congruent. So here would be a kite. A kite would be this side is congruent to this side. These are consecutive, they touch each other. And then this side is congruent to this side. So consecutive mean these two sides in a row and these two sides in a row. A trapezoid has one set of parallel sides. So a trapezoid would be like this. One set of opposite sides parallelogram, whereas a parallelogram has 2 sets of opposite sides parallel. An isosceles trapezoid is a specific type of trapezoid, so it has opposite sides parallel, but it also has base angles that are congruent, and these two sides are congruent. So the sides that are not parallel are congruent. That's an isosceles trapezoid. Down here, classify the figure as many ways as possible. So it's kind of like if you lived in Grand Rapids, you live in Michigan, and you live in the US. A hierarchy could be like this is Illinois and this is Chicago. So everybody that lives in Grand Rapids lives in Michigan. Everybody that lives in Michigan lives in the US. But just because you live in the US does not mean you live in Michigan. So to classify the figure means name all the spots. If you lived in Grand Rapids, then you automatically live in Michigan in the US. So you would write Grand Rapids, Michigan, and US. So now let's go back up here. If you're a square, right here, then you would write rectangle, rhombus, parallelogram, and quadrilateral. If it's a trapezoid, you would write trapezoid and quadrilateral. If it's a kite, you would write kite, quadrilateral. That's what it means to classify as many. So looking at these markings, I see that opposite sides, there's one set of opposite sides parallel, so it's called a parallelogram, and which also makes it a quadrilateral. This one has 4 90-degree angles, so this has to be a rectangle, and we know if it's a rectangle, it's a parallelogram, and if we know it's a parallelogram, it's a quadrilateral. This next one has 4 congruent sides, but there's no other angle markings, so it's a rhombus. If it's a rhombus, it's a parallelogram, and if it's a parallelogram, it's a quadrilateral. The fourth one I see that opposite sides are congruent. So the only one it can be is a kite, or not a kite, but a parallelogram and a quadrilateral. At first I thought it looked like a kite, but for it to be a kite, it would have to be these two sides are congruent and these two sides are congruent. So it's not a kite. And then the third one is an isosceles trapezoid. We have one set of sides congruent. Right here, these sides are congruent, and then these opposite sides are parallel. So this is an isosceles trapezoid, which makes it a trapezoid, which automatically makes it a quadrilateral. If the directions say, determine the most precise name, so that would be if somebody asked you where you lived, you'd give them the most precise name. You would say Grand Rapids. So if you look back on the hierarchy, you have to give it the most specific name. So this one I see 4 sides congruent. So this is a rhombus. And the second one has 2 pairs of consecutive sides congruent. So that is going to be a kite. The third one has 4 90s and 4 sides congruent, so that's a square. And the fourth one has 2 sets of opposite sides parallel, so that's a parallelogram. And then the last one has 1 set of opposite sides parallel, so that's trapezoid. Okay, for this next part, we are going to look at identify whether it's true or false. You have to think of the hierarchy. Are all quadrilaterals or parallelograms? That's false. Because kites are quadrilaterals and they are not parallelograms. Every trapezoid is an isosceles. Nope, so that's false. Maybe it would help to draw out this hierarchy again. So we have quadrilateral, kite, trapezoid, isosceles trapezoid, parallelogram, rectangle, rhombus, and square. So every square is a rhombus. Is it true that all of these squares are rhombuses? Yes, that's true. Some rectangles are rhombuses. Some 90-degree angle. So this means some figures that have 4 90s also have sides that are congruent. This one's actually true. It's kind of tricky because that would be squares. Squares are the rectangles that are rhombuses. A square is a rhombus that's a rectangle, or a rectangle that's a rhombus. Same thing. All squares are rectangles. That's true. All of these squares are rectangles. All rectangles are squares. That's not true. Not all of these rectangles are squares. That's false. And then the next part, I'm not going to do all these. I'll just explain. If we know this is a rhombus, then we know that all of these sides are congruent. So to solve for b, I would set 3b plus 2 equal to 4b minus 2 and solve for b. So b equals 4. And then to find a, I would set these two equal. Down here, if this is a square, solve the missing side lengths. So I would set these two equal, and I would set these two equal. Nothing too complicated about that. Make sure you know the hierarchy, answering true and false questions about the hierarchy, and also the difference between classify, which means list them all out, and then determine the most precise name is just give me one of the names, the most specific names.